those of you who know our group and have known us for a while know that we have been a big supporter of carbon pricing for years and years, even as the Pew Center on Global Climate Change. We spend a lot of time studying how you price carbon, whether it's through a cap and trade mechanism, whether it's through a clean energy standard, or even a straight-up carbon tax. The reason we've spent so much time on this one particular policy mechanism is that we agree with the majority of economists who are out there that say, you know, pricing carbon is the most efficient and effective way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and also stimulate energy innovation. Of course, we're already paying a price. We already see a cost of the greenhouse gas fueling climate change and the damaging and the damages that are significantly affected by climate change, namely rising sea levels, droughts, severity of fires, and downpours. And so pricing carbon just makes sense. It makes sense to put the cost of those damages in the bottom line of decision making. Also, the nice thing about pricing carbon, I'm a particular fan of that, is that it's not the government picking winners and losers. It allows business the right way, or at least allows business the flexibility to figure out the right way for them of reducing their emissions. Today, we have a few friends who've spent a long time, like us, thinking about how to price carbon. We've invited them in here today to talk about the options and the paths forward. And before we get to those paths, I want to take just a little minute to talk about where carbon pricing is globally. I think folks who haven't been following this issue might say, gee, you know, that topic, that's kind of an old news. Nobody's doing that. Well, in fact, we see carbon pricing growing around the world. Did you know that South Korea is on track to do a cap and trade program by 2015? That Alberta, Canada has had a carbon price since 2007. British Columbia has a carbon tax. Quebec has linked with California. South Africa is putting plans in place for a carbon tax. And there's many regions in China that have pilots for carbon and emissions trading. Eventually, about 250 million people will be covered by a carbon price in China. That's not insignificant. And we have carbon pricing here in the United States. We have 9 states in the Northeast under the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, and we have California, the second largest cap and trade program in the world, right after the EU, who also has had a carbon price since 2005. So here in the U.S., if you think about the regional greenhouse gas station, you think about California, that's about a quarter of the U.S. population that actually lives in states that have a carbon price. And in fact, we have an opportunity, perhaps, to have more states with carbon pricing, and the avenue for that would be EPA's proposed carbon standard for existing power plants. We expect this proposal rule to be out June 2nd. And an important question, I know that many folks in this room and elsewhere that care about the climate issue are asking themselves is, how much flexibility is EPA going to allow? Are they going to allow cap and trade to count? Are they going to allow carbon pricing of some way, shape, or form? My colleague, Senior Fellow Kyle Ahrens, will be leading that conversation in our second panel this morning. We're going to start this morning's conversation, though, a little higher up. We've got Adele Morris and Aparna Mathur. Their biographies were out on the front table. Adele is a fellow and policy director for the Climate and Energy Economics Project at the Brookings Institute, and Aparna is a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. They'll talk about carbon pricing more generally, and they'll give you a few highlights from a new C2ES report they've just authored for us called Carbon Tax and Broader U.S. Fiscal Reform, Design, and Distributional Options. The report basically lays out the case for taxing something we don't want, like carbon pollution, and reducing taxes on things we want to encourage, like productivity and employment. Before I bring Adele and Aparna up, though, I'd like to thank the Alex C. Walker Educational and Charitable Foundation, specifically Alex Walker, who couldn't be with us here today, but who funded our report for us. I appreciate that. One last little logistics issue. If you put your cell phones on silent, we'd really appreciate it. Okay, Adele, do you want to get the conversation started here?
Thank you, Janet. Thanks to Janet and C2ES and all the good people there for instigating this project and connecting me with Aparna to do this report. This is it. It's got a purple cover. It's on the back table. Please take one. I'm going to give you the highlights of this report in just real briefly, because we're going to move on to some discussion. But I just wanted to talk about this paper because it's a useful guide to policymakers on the design of a carbon tax. Why would you do it? How would you do it? What are the issues you'd confront if you tried to do it? And with an eye towards being economically responsible in the ways we go about mitigating greenhouse gas emissions. And we're taking an economic perspective, and that means thinking about climate change as a market failure. When I put gas in my car, the price I pay includes the cost to produce and market that fuel, but it doesn't include the cost to the environment of those combustion gases. And so economically, what we want to do with a carbon tax is internalize those costs and ensure that the prices we pay reflect the full social costs of the goods and services we consume. A carbon tax is an extremely efficient way to do that because it changes the relative prices of different fuels an exact amount related to the damage that they cause the environment. Now, why are we talking about this in the context of broader fiscal reform? Well, when we add a new tax into the revenue system, it gives us opportunities to use other changes in the tax system that we might have wanted to do anyway to create a policy portfolio that makes sense as a whole. So I'm going to start with two basic outcomes of a carbon tax. We know and you can see the reams of peer-reviewed research in the back of that report that we went through, that a carbon tax can raise substantial revenue. So these are 5 illustrative studies of a carbon tax in the United States. The lowest numbers there are a modeling result from our model that where the tax was about $18 in 2015 and went up about 4% over inflation. The highest one was a similar tax that started a little higher, but you can see that we're looking at between $100 and $200 billion per year of revenue to start. And that depends both on your tax rate and which emissions exactly you tax. Another fundamental result is that the carbon tax is going to lower emissions. Every modeling study shows that demand for fossil fuels slopes downward. When you make them more expensive, people use less of them. And we can see that depending on the carbon tax design and the modeling approach, a relatively modest carbon tax trajectory can get us between 20% and 30% reductions by 2030 relative to baseline. So I'm going to talk about how to think about the costs of a carbon tax, but I want to emphasize when I'm talking about the macroeconomic effects of a carbon tax, the point to this is to avoid even more costly environmental damages. So don't infer anything about the net benefits of these policies when I start talking about the economic effects of the tax. We know that there are a number of key factors that are going to affect the cost of a tax. Again, the tax rate and how much of the economy it applies to. Critically, what happens to the revenue? I'm going to delve into that a little bit more. And the predictability of the tax. It's much more efficient to have a tax that people know is coming, they know what that price is going to be, and then they can efficiently invest accordingly to those expected prices. And one corollary to that is it's better to have a tax that people feel is viable and permanent than one that's maybe higher but people think may not last very long. So there is that kind of design art to getting that sweet spot to keep that price feasible and predictable. So one way to think about how a carbon tax changes emissions is through a marginal abatement cost curve. And you haven't had a lecture in economics unless somebody was talking about marginal something, so I wouldn't want to disappoint you. So this graph starts at the origin. Moving to the right is incremental abatement. So you can see that the first few tons you abate, moving to the right from the origin, have a cost of fairly low dollars per ton abated. And the further you go out, you start abating at higher and higher incremental costs. So what the tax does is induce all the abatement that's cost effective up to that price. And then above that, it's cheaper to pay the tax. And so the remaining revenues have a tax associated with them, and that's the green rectangle. Now, people often think about taxes as costs, but really they're transfers. They're a transfer from the people who pay those higher prices for fuels to the people who get the revenue. So that's why ultimately the distributional outcomes of this policy depend very heavily on what happens to the revenue. So the design elements of a tax, whatever you do, you're going to confront these issues. Your tax base, your tax rate. What do you do about other environmental policies? Do you change them or do you put the tax on top of them? What do you do about competitiveness? What do you do with the revenue? And how do you manage distributional outcomes? And in particular, any burdens on the poor. So let's talk about the tax base. The most efficient thing to do, of course, is to have a price signal that is as broad as possible around all the greenhouse gases and sources in the economy. That harmonizes all the incentives so that you're not inadvertently pushing on higher abatement cost areas and when there are opportunities that would be cheaper elsewhere. And most of this is going to fall on carbon dioxide based on our inventory. And then each fuel has different carbon content, so you're changing the relative price of different fuels. For example, natural gas has about half the carbon per unit of energy as coal. Okay, so we'll talk about the tax rate. Now, some of this is a little bit more art than science. Theoretically, what you want is a tax that reflects the environmental damages, right? Because we're internalizing those external costs. The challenge, of course, is monetizing all of those environmental damages. And there are several stages of uncertainties and difficulties analytically to come to a social cost on carbon. It's kind of a sort of an intractable exercise. The Obama administration has come up with a range that includes $12 to about $41 per ton of carbon, and that's an estimate, again, of the damages that would be created by an incremental of a ton of CO2 in the atmosphere. So a tax in that range could very well make sense. Another way to look at it is, what is everybody else doing? And that ranges from around $9 for the European trading system, almost $30 in Canada in the British Columbia tax program, up to over $150 in Sweden. And some of these have different tax bases. Some are economy-wide. Another option would be to think about what would the EPA estimates have been for the Waxman-Markey legislation that passed the House. That would have been around $15. So, there we go. You can kind of pick what you think is feasible and reasonable. Now, what do you do about other policies? Well, one thing you could do is use a carbon tax to substitute for less efficient regulatory measures that we're now starting to see being developed by the EPA. There are going to be a series of rules under the Clean Air Act. The first one affecting existing stationary sources is going to fall on power plants, but then there'll be subsequent rules for other source categories. You could also make the case that if you're going to tax fossil fuels, you don't necessarily need to subsidize renewables and cleaner sources, right? So deployment subsidies could be a case for unraveling those. What do you do about state policies? Do you preempt them, or do you allow states to put their policies in conjunction with your federal carbon tax? One thing we know for sure, though, that internalizing external costs of emissions doesn't fix all the market failures. There's still a market failure in the public good qualities of basic research and development. So you don't want to offset that, because that serves another fundamental economic purpose. So what do you do about competitiveness concerns? If we have a carbon tax and our trading partners don't, what happens? There's at least 5 ways to deal with that. Number 1, vigorous diplomacy. Leverage our carbon ambition into equivalent action by our interlocutors in the climate negotiations. Start the tax modestly and move it up gradually so that everybody has time to adjust, including our energy-intensive trade-exposed industries. Use the tax to lower other taxes. And I'm going to talk about that more in a second. Replace other less efficient regulation. That's a pro-competitive thing right there. And then for the remaining competitive issues, impose carefully circumscribed border adjustments for those energy-intensive trade-exposed firms. Now let's talk about the revenue. What are you going to do with it? Well, probably the top 3 things to do with it from an economic perspective would be to lower the federal budget deficit, which means lowering other taxes in the future, or lowering the need to raise other taxes in the future, and lowering the burden of the debt, reducing other taxes on working, saving, investing, and protecting the poor from the effects of the increases in energy prices. Now, why do people talk about lowering other taxes? Well, one reason is that our tax system has this, is widely viewed as making U.S. economy less competitive than other countries. And this chart to the right shows how the U.S. statutory tax rate on corporate income has remained the same even as other countries have lowered their statutory tax rates. So while we stood still, others lowered their taxes, and this is viewed as being quite a disadvantage to our business enterprises. Now, of course, the effective rate and the statutory rate are 2 different things, but there is evidence to suggest that capital tax reduction in conjunction with a carbon tax imposition could have a net pro-growth effect. And this other chart, hot off the presses from our model, shows that if you have a modest carbon tax starting at about $15 a ton, going at 4% over inflation, can have a net pro-growth effect on GDP. And we get similar growth in employment, real wages, and consumption. So there's no evidence here that this is necessarily a job-killing energy tax. So I'm going to turn it to Aparna to talk about incidence.
Thanks, Adele. So let me talk about incidence. When we talk about the incidence of a carbon tax, what does it mean? As Adele already mentioned, when you impose a carbon tax, you're imposing the tax on fossil fuels. You're imposing a tax on the factors that go into the production of everyday items. You know, when producers buy coal, oil, natural gas, we use gasoline, all of those prices are likely to go up as a result of the carbon tax. So how are those price increases going to affect a typical household? That's what we mean by incidence of a tax or the burden of the tax on a regular household. So the carbon tax increases the cost of these fossil intensive energy items when firms go and buy these raw materials or buy these energy goods for producing everyday items, their costs go up. And what firms can do is, they can absorb the cost, but they can pass the costs of the carbon tax on to consumers in the form of higher prices, or they can also pass the tax on to workers in the form of lower wages, or to shareholders, by reducing the returns to capital. So there are various ways, and economists have modeled all of these different ways of what would happen if you had a carbon tax in the economy that increased the cost of production for firms. What would a typical firm do with those cost increases, and how would they be reflected in prices of goods? How would they be reflected in a lowering of the return to factors of production, like workers and like labor and capital? Now, let's focus for a second on just the burden on households. So the burden for a typical household, once you estimate the price increases, and in research that Adele and I have done, we estimate that the price increases for everyday items could be, for non-energy items could be less than 1%, but for a lot of energy items like gasoline, home heating, and so on, the price increases could be more than 1% and could significantly add to the burden of a typical household. But it will vary, the distributional impact will vary a lot, obviously, depending on how much energy a typical household consumes. How energy intensive or how carbon intensive are the products that people are consuming. Now, if you estimates suggest that before we even account for what the revenue from the carbon tax does, if you just talk about the costs, a carbon tax can be fairly regressive. And what do we mean by regressive? Regressive means that as a share of income, the burden on a typical low-income household is likely to be much higher than the burden on a higher-income household. And this happens because poorer households spend a larger fraction of their income on energy-intensive goods, and that's true whether we look at direct energy consumption items, as I said, like gasoline consumption, home heating, and so electricity usage, and so on, or when we look at indirect energy items. By indirect, we mean all the other things that a household consumes, like clothing, shoes, food, all the goods that are being produced in the economy that use energy and that will face a price increase as a result of a carbon tax. If you look at the combination of the burden from the direct and indirect consumption items, you find that a tax is fairly regressive, and that's before we account for what we use the revenues for. So these two charts show you what the burden for a typical household will be. Now, there are two ways that we can depict the share of the burden. The typical assumption is, how do carbon taxes affect the burden as a share of income? Because when we think of the burden, we say, well, if you're a low-income household, we find that, so this chart on the left shows you at the very bottom 10% of households, the number one shows the very bottom 10% of households face a total carbon tax burden of about 3.5% of income, of which the indirect component is approximately 1 percentage point, and the rest is the direct component. So as you would expect, the direct component is obviously a lot larger than the indirect component. For the top households, which is represented by the 10, the bar for the top 10% of households, the overall tax burden is between 1 and 0.5%. So it's fairly low. It's the tax burden at the bottom is about 3 times the tax burden at the top, which is why we call the carbon tax regressive. It's going to affect lower income households a lot more than higher income households. But there is also this debate in economics that maybe we should be measuring the burden as a fraction of consumption, because consumption is a better predictor of lifetime incomes for a typical household. Consumption is a better indicator of standards of living, of material well-being, and sometimes you see fluctuations in annual income, but that doesn't necessarily mean that households are necessarily leading, much worse standard have necessarily a much worse standard of living than their income suggests. So when you look at consumption, people tend to smooth consumption. People tend to keep their consumption at the same level by borrowing in, low-income years and saving in high-income years. And so consumption may be arguably a better measure of household welfare than income. So we also showed the share of the carbon tax burden as a fraction of consumption, of typical consumption for a household. And again, the tax is still regressive in the sense that people at the bottom 10% still face a higher share of the tax than as a fraction of consumption than people at the very top. But the distribution is more even because consumption tends to be a lot more evenly distributed than income. Now, as I said, all of those charts assume that we're not doing anything with the carbon tax revenues, that the revenues that the government gets through a carbon tax are simply an increase in revenues for the government, and those revenues are not going back to households in the form of rebates and so on. But what we show in the paper, Adele and I show in a paper, is that a lot depends on how you use the revenues of a carbon tax. So let's say if we use the carbon tax revenues to do a corporate tax swap. So as Adele mentioned, corporate tax is arguably a distortionary tax. It's a tax that distorts people's choices about how much to save and invest. There are lots of inefficiencies of a carbon tax, lots of deadweight losses associated with a corporate income tax in the economy. So what if we use the carbon tax revenues to reduce corporate income taxes? Okay, what would be the effect of that on a typical household? And does that change the regressivity? Does that offset the burden of the tax on lower income households? And we experimented with doing a tax swap with corporate income taxes, a tax swap with just personal income taxes. And what we find is that if any of those tax swaps would actually help lower income households in the sense that you would end up returning a part of the revenues to lower income households. It would help them offset some of the regressivity. But given the fact that richer households pay a larger share of these taxes to begin with, even when you rebate the revenues as a share of the payments made as corporate income taxes or as personal income taxes, you do find that the regressivity of the tax still exists. That the lower income households are still worse off after the tax, but they're not as badly off as in a situation where you did not rebate the revenues at all. So probably a lump sum rebate to lower income households may be the best, maybe the most efficient means of holding lower income households harmless. And what we estimate is that if you use about 15% of the revenues and just rebate them to lower income households as maybe lump sum rebates or having a tax policy that is efficiently designed so that the money is effectively targeted, then you could hold the bottom 20 to 30% of households harmless. So there are ways that we could design a carbon tax that could offset the regressivity for lower income households, that could keep them harmless, that could, we could still get the efficiency of a carbon tax in the sense of getting reductions in pollution and offsetting the negative externality, but at the same time not burden lower income households a lot. So thank you.
So, we had to start a little bit late this morning. I have a few questions, but I also would like to invite questions from the audience at this point. So I'm going to start with the first question, and then if anybody has a question from the audience, please, we have a mic there in the center, and then we'll continue for about another 15 minutes or so. Adele, once you get up there.
Yep.
Now, those chairs aren't the most sturdy. So thinking about this carbon tax, is there any different outcome if we put the tax at the state or at the federal, or what are your thoughts on a state versus federal implementation of a carbon tax?
Well, I would consider the federal carbon excise tax approach that we've outlined in our paper to be the first best. I mean, if you could get new authority and you could design it well, you have this comprehensive economy-wide price signal, that's going to be the best approach. If you can't do that and you're looking for alternatives, another approach might be something like the bill that Congressman Delaney just released yesterday that would give states a specific option to price carbon at the state level in compliance with EPA rules. And if you can't do that, then you're probably looking at how do you make the best use out of the existing Clean Air Act authority to do the most economically efficient implementation of that. And I think we're going to hear a little bit more about that in the next session, but the basic idea would be to allow each state to do some of the pro-growth tax reforms that I just described at the federal level, but do those at the state level and have a state implementation plan that includes a tax swap, for example. And a lot of states have fiscal deficits. They have unmet spending needs from the form of, for example, underfunded pension funds. There are a lot of state revenue needs. And it could be very useful for states to price carbon and accomplish those goals while complying with the requirements of the EPA regulations.
Right. Aparna, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I agree with Adele. I think if we have a uniform federal tax, that sends a stronger signal than, and obviates the need for every state to sort of, push through that legislation and increase the administrative costs, essentially. So I think if you had a nationwide carbon tax, that would be a much more effective signal than having state-by-state legislation that would be maybe more costly and tougher to push through.
We have a question from the audience. Please go back to the mic if you have a question. We've got our first person lined up back there.
I just have two little questions. When you were saying, Adele, that there'd be a 20 to 30% reduction relative to the baseline over the 5 models, what year was the baseline?
The baseline is essentially the trajectory of emissions under business as usual conditions. So the way modelers simulate these taxes is you have a baseline scenario that says without any particular policy intervention, what would emissions be doing? And then you impose a policy scenario that would add in those price signals at whatever level you specify, and then watch the difference between the baseline and the outcomes of the simulated policies. And so, for example, if you didn't think those emissions reductions were enough, you can simulate policy scenarios with higher carbon tax levels. If you didn't like the economic outcomes or something else, you can simulate something else. And then by doing this over and over again, which is how some of us spend our time, there's no accounting for taste here, you can gradually elucidate the trade-offs associated with greater stringency and better environmental performance.
Okay, and the second and last question. What would happen if all the taxes were refunded to households equally as a dividend, with the government taking nothing?
Well, so that's a common proposal, and there are two dimensions to the answer. One is what happens distributionally, and if you did a cap or a tax and dividend type thing where every household got the same amount, actually poorer households would be better off than they would be before the tax, and richer households would be worse off. So there would be a definite redistributional effect of that policy. What you don't get, though, is any alleviation of other tax burdens or any reduction in the distortionary effects of those other taxes. So it means that you're foregoing an opportunity to do something beneficial for the economy. So you get perhaps what some may view as a progressive economic distributional outcome, but you're going to get worse macroeconomic performance from that policy because all those existing tax burdens stay in there unabated.
So you just don't have enough money to use it for everything.
So I think there's this fundamental trade-off between equity goals and efficiency goals, and this is where the art of this kind of policy design comes in. You know, how should you allocate? I'll tell you one thing you don't want to do with the revenue. You don't want to pay for stuff that's going to happen as a result of the tax. Like, so people want to say, well, we want to subsidize renewables. Well, why subsidize renewables? You just taxed fossil carbon, right? So use the money not to duplicate what the tax is intended to do, because you're just going to compensate people for what they're going to do anyway, or you're going to drive abatement that is inefficiently costly, neither of which make any economic
Unless,
sense.
of course, you're using the revenue to deal with other market failures.
Right. So I mentioned the research, et cetera, but there's no good governance reason to earmark the carbon tax revenue for specific spending purposes on any one thing. That, in my view, speaking for myself, should go through the rigors of the appropriations process. What you want to think carefully about is making that equity efficiency trade-off in a smart way.
Jane, you have a question? Can you keep it a little short?
Sure. Thank you for the excellent presentation. You mentioned the concerns about international competitiveness of energy-intensive industries, and you mentioned a border tax adjustment as one way of addressing that, and I'm wondering whether you have looked at how much of a border tax adjustment would be required to compensate those, or whether you've looked at other ways. And this is slightly taking issue with your last point. There are transitional costs depending on how rapidly the tax is phased in, and one option would be assisting in various ways with that. Thank you.
Yes, thanks for that question. There's actually a really big and excellent literature grappling with the competitiveness effects of a unilateral price on carbon, and we survey some of that literature in in the paper. And I guess to summarize it at a very high level is that, yes, particularly if the U.S. has an ambitious and unilateral price on carbon for some very specific energy-intensive, trade-exposed industries, there can be an effect of that is worthy of consideration in the policy design. And there are lots of different ways to do that. There's output-based rebating. There's a whole ton of different proposals on how to deal with that. But I guess I would say that what you want to deal, all those special rebates and border tax adjustments, in my view, should be addressing the remainder of the competitiveness issue after you've done all the things of aggressive diplomacy and pro-growth tax reform and all the other things. And for the remainder of those disparities, there's a legitimate concern, and you want to target those carefully. You don't want to make it a venue for protectionist mischief, is, I guess, what I want to say.
Protectionist mischief. I like that.
Hi, I'm Scott Palmer. I'm from the Citizens Climate Lobby, and we agree with you about a steady, gradual signal being an important key. We also support returning the revenue all to the people, and I understand your concern about R&D, but here's another question I wanted to ask. The value in returning money to people not only corrects the regressive tax, but also creates a base of support, which I think is important for us not only switching to green, but switching to green quicker because people get a check every month that encourages them to do things. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that kind of salience of the rebates really does have a political effect. And so I totally understand that argument. But I guess I'm mindful that it comes at an opportunity cost of doing something more efficient in the broader fiscal reform. So, I think that's kind of a judgment call of, how do you come down on allocating resources to fix any equity concerns? How do you try to improve the economic efficiency of the revenue system and our deficit situation? And then how do you design it in a way that optimizes the politics of the whole thing? And so you guys see this is a real challenge, but one of the things we're really trying to do in this paper is to kind of say, well, what does the economic peer-reviewed literature have to say about all of these things? Unfortunately, it doesn't say a whole lot about the politics. And so maybe I'm going to have to get a political scientist on board next time.
But I think just to add to what you said, I think it's absolutely true that if we think that there's a likelihood that a carbon tax would actually be politically feasible, it would have to be part of a tax reform package. I mean, I don't think there's sort of a desire to have an additional tax in the system without offsetting other distortionary taxes, which is a big reason why there is this sort of new research sort of suggesting that if we did away with these other distortionary taxes, maybe there is a place for a carbon tax, and maybe that's why we should push it through, because you could get a double dividend in the sense that you're reducing other distortionary taxes and at the same time getting the environmental benefits associated with the carbon tax.
I think that's a good point. I mean, I'm not perceiving any appetite for standalone climate legislation. So part of the motivation for this work is to say, if we're not going to have a standalone climate bill, rebates or otherwise, where could a carbon excise tax feature in legislative packages that might be moving for other reasons and might have bipartisan support for other reasons? And so maybe that's kind of our political rejoinder to your point, which I also understand.
And one last thing, there's a lot of ways to return the revenue. And there's a lot of different options. Well, we're going to explore that in our next panel, but just to add, like the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, for example, takes their revenue and uses it for energy efficiency because people are really concerned about their bills, not necessarily the price. So you reduce the consumption of energy, that's what people are interested in, and their bills are actually reduced. So there's a lot of ways to actually compensate and help those that are affected by a higher price on carbon. With that, I'd like to close this session down and thank our speakers. And invite our next group up.